This is New Day Northwest. Now, here's Margaret Larson.
Good morning, everybody. How are you? Good morning, and welcome to New Day Northwest. We're very glad you're with us here this morning. Among the topics we have for you today is the big mobile food rodeo. We are cooking yummy beef flatbread, and we'll tell you how you can sample some of the best of the best. Stylist Darcy Camden's here to present New Day's first ever Jeans Awards. Believe it or not, she's found some great denim jeans for under $25. And former Seattle Mayor Norm Rice stops by to fill us in on how you can give big tomorrow, stretching your charitable donations for the best causes in the Northwest. But first today, it's New Day's Hot Topic Week, and today we are discussing a scary rash of violent crime in the Northwest. In fact, assaults with firearms are up 51% in the city of Seattle, and homicides are up by 267% compared to this time last year, according to the Seattle Police Department. So is there any way to know why and how we can protect ourselves and our families? Here to weigh in, our panel today, please welcome psychologist Christine Barrett, attorney Ann Bremner, and UW professor and digital media expert Hanson Hossein. Welcome to all of you. Really appreciate you being here. Let's talk first of all about this latest crime, the Keller crime with the murder of a wife and daughter, and the husband found in a bunker that he'd built. This is the kind of thing that sticks with people because it is so heinous and so creepy and had been going on, apparently, the building of this bunker for such a long time. And what do you make of things like this?
It's just like he wants to be a survivalist, but he wants to survive only by himself. You know, the family's gone, the pets are gone, everything else. We've been hanging on developments in this case every day in Seattle, on the radio, on the news, and everything else, thinking, how could he be this way? And how could his coworkers not have seen anything? At least his boss didn't. And then we think, you know, what led him to this? You know, is it mental illness? Is it, you know, a fear factor in this day and age where we're disconnected through the internet? You know, violence begins violence in terms of what we see. I mean, what did he expect to do in there at the end of the day? And we want to know why, because we want to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. And I think that's so much of what we deal with, at least as a lawyer, I see in the criminal justice system. How do we stop it?
I think it's a natural thing. You know, you look at that and you think, okay, nobody seemed to know that anything was amiss here. How do I protect myself? If I can't understand this, then I can't protect myself and my family. What do we make of things like this where nobody seems to know that something's amiss? Same thing happened with the guy who flew the plane into the IRS office in Austin, Texas. Nothing to indicate that there was something wrong, and then something cataclysmic happens.
Well, hopefully maybe the family saw some indications coming early on. I mean, there were some indications that he had been building this for 8 years, so somebody must have known something was going on.
You'd think.
That and his social isolation. I mean, we talked about this earlier, that somebody who kind of detaches himself from others. I mean, I think there's an indication that he didn't do things with other people after work. He didn't have really close relationships with other people. I mean, that's kind of an indication that something's not quite right. So I think both those factors, one, that he's detached, and two, that somebody must have had some indication that something wasn't quite right.
And we need to be keeping an eye out because there's so much that can happen so suddenly. If you've ever been the victim of a violent crime, you know that it's 1 second's fine and the next second something horrible has happened. Hanson, you're such an expert in digital media. I'm wondering, for example, there were a rash of robberies in my neighborhood recently, and everybody emailed everybody, and there were tweets, and there were, you know, so you don't know, okay, is this really worse than it used to be, or are we just much better about telling each other about it?
Yeah, we're much more aware of it. It's a double-edged sword of communication. On one hand, we're able to sort of prepare ourselves and protect ourselves by talking to each other about it. On the other hand, it exacerbates the awareness because now we're beginning to think about it a little bit too much, and all of a sudden we're not able to get beyond that, and that's what we're focusing on in this situation here with the bunker, is that you got somebody here who's living in fear, doesn't trust society anymore, and we know in the last 20 or 30 years the bonds of society in this country, especially from a trust point of view, have completely fallen apart. The question is, does the internet make it better or make it worse? And that's what we're attacking right now.
And maybe it does both.
I think so. I think in terms of creating those bonds, we have, you know, there's a book called Bowling Alone from about 20 years ago saying that America's falling apart from a trust point of view, and some of my colleagues say, well, the internet and social media actually help us come back together, but it's such a weak connection, and people can hide behind anonymity that we don't know whether that's actually making a difference.
Yeah. If you want to lose faith in your fellow man, just visit the comments section on just about anything.
I second that emotion.
You can't do it anymore. All right, let's talk about the Powell case. Again, a case of a family being wiped out in the most horrific way. Is this something that we have seen over time in the same numbers, or does it seem like there's more of this lately And I think most people find this the most unbelievable crime, parents who kill their children.
And this, I think, you know, I represent the grandparents, Chuck and Judy Cox, in that case. And they're the best, most wonderful, lovely people. And they really fell to such evil with their daughter's disappearance. We know she's dead. And then, of course, you know, with the hatchet and a fire, you know, with Josh Powell and Braden and Charlie. It's the worst, I mean, I've ever seen in my career. I think we're just, in America, dumbfounded by the evil in this case. But evil's always been around. And we have to have, I think, some punishment in the laws. We deal with retribution, rehabilitation is another thing, restitution and deterrence are the purposes of sentencing. But I think we've got to take a look at what's going to stop this kind of thing. You know, what would have stopped Josh Powell? And, you know, just one other thing, he wasn't arrested in Utah. He should have been. You know, there was blood, there was a note from her, he's going to kill her. He was camping in the snow at midnight with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and he took out $3.5 million in life insurance. If he could have been arrested, the boys could be alive. You know, you just
looking back, that case is so
learned.
hard to understand how it unfolded the way it did and went on for so long. Christine, how do we think about this in terms of protecting ourselves and whether or not you don't want to live in fear? There was that terrible shooting in Pioneer Square where a girl was killed. Yep. Just a drive-by, you know, just this random thing. And that sticks in your head, even though statistically you're much more likely to just be killed in a car wreck, and yet we don't find riding in a car terrifying. Yep. So how do we put these events in context so that we can go forward in a positive way?
Well, we have to be careful with the media because it can just develop fear. I mean, we just become more fearful, and it can inhibit us from doing any kind of action. What we need to do is think about how we can, as individuals and as a community, take action against violence and develop a community and a society that's nonviolent. That means that in our individual lives, we look at, you know, what kind of influences that we are involved in our media, our relationships with our kids, with our family. How do we interact with others? Is there violence in the way that we interact? And we need to take steps to eliminate violence from our lives. And then we also need to provide support for those who are living in situations of violence and make sure that, you know, families that are involved in domestic violence, that's stopped, that they either get out or they get help, and that we don't let it go on in secret. We provide ways to let it come out.
Just like in the Powell case, to take some action in those cases early on and to intervene. Hanson, since you are around students all the time, I'm curious how young people feel about these issues. We had the case of little Amina, who was shot accidentally by a classmate who brought a gun to school. And kids hear about these things, whether or not we let them watch the news. You've got young kids. It's amazing, by osmosis, they seem to know what's going on. And then you work around college kids. And I'm wondering how they feel about their world.
I think this world is a much less controlled world. Public discourse used to be regulated essentially by media, by these large organizations such as the television station we're on right now. And to a certain extent, we could actually keep a certain level of discourse. That has really fallen, you know, because we don't have control over that anymore. People talk to each other. And so they're able to say things you would not normally hear in public. And we talked about the comments on King 5's site, for example. People tend to say things to the extreme because there's a lack of accountability.
Right.
So
they normally wouldn't say
exactly, they wouldn't normally say that. And
I would hope not.
and we've seen every one of these stories have degraded almost into a political battle. Some things seems to sort of be about a bomber and gun control and whatever else. And so the fact that we can't regulate that discourse is a real challenge for us. And for me, fundamentally, that means we have to actually start teaching our kids media literacy at a very young age. They have to know how to communicate civically, responsibly, and ethically, because they can actually reach the world now at age 5 or 6. That's incredible. It's an incredible amount of power, and that's a matter of responsibility and accountability
and
as
we have
well.
to make sure they have limits.
Absolutely.
On that, their involvement in media, we need to make sure that they have limits as far as what they have access to and how much they have access to. I mean, how often they're on the internet or chat rooms or things like that. We need to make sure that we monitor it.
And we as adults need to also. I was looking the other day at a story on the Seattle Times website, and I looked in the commentary section. Like I said, always a mistake. It's like wearing a hat. Don't do it. It's just bad. And there was some, to me, that's always a mistake. So I'm looking through, and there's some guy who's just made this completely, well, it looked like a guy's name, a completely ugly commentary. He's posted 2,000 some odd times on the Seattle Times, and I'm thinking, whoa, dude, this has got to be bad for you to be sitting at home just spewing out this bile. Maybe we need to have a conversation about growing up and taking responsibility for our communications.
Well, these aren't healthy communities. When people can't actually have this kind of proper polite discourse, and somebody finds great credibility in commenting 2,000 times, there's something that's not quite right there. And so when you have these larger communities around the Seattle Times or King 5, people don't know each other, so they can yell at each other. When you have smaller communities where there is a certain level of accountability, it's much more civil. So we have to find a way to actually cultivate that kind of conversation.
And I think the civility, you know, overall is so important. And now we also deal with everyone's a journalist, nobody's a journalist. I mean, there's that whole problem now with what's on the internet, and it says
who do we believe?
Right, it says news, but then it's something that's really not news, and then we don't have the regulation either. And so I think, like you said, we need to get back to civility in the comment section, starting there, hopefully, maybe have people not being anonymous, you know, and just taking shots, you know, from their living room couch.
That it was just like you with your name, and you had to take responsibility for it, and that would take care of, you know, would guess a great deal of that.
Yeah.
And in terms of kids, because we're all, you know, everybody has kids in their lives, or parents are dealing with this. There's a level of violence that occurs as entertainment at night, in the movies, etc. I worry that we're just inured by this, and that we don't really understand what the consequence of violence is.
Yeah, so in our homes, we need to make sure that we're eliminating also the exposure to violence in our homes by the media or by parents. And we also need to make sure we're teaching the opposite. We're teaching compassion and empathy, and giving kids opportunities to develop compassion and empathy, so that they have, you know, the opposite being taught and instilled within them.
And that's probably always been true, but is it more important now because we're so bombarded by these other things that kids need an antidote to this?
They need an armor. They need
I need an antidote to this.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right, they are bombarded, and they do need to know an alternative way of interacting with each other.
Right.
And we need to teach, we need to actively teach that. Instead of passively hope that they develop those abilities, we need to actively take a stance and teach our children.
Yeah, we can't change the world, but we can change what happens in our own homes.
And start with ourselves.
Absolutely.
We can monitor the media that we pay attention to or that we feed our families. And we can monitor the way that we touch and we talk to our children. We can monitor the way that we interact with coworkers or neighbors. We can change those things beginning today.
And I hope we can kind of lead a movement that you don't write or say anything that you wouldn't want to put your name to.
Absolutely. Or that you wouldn't say in person.
That you wouldn't say in person, so that we can begin to build a world that's a little safer, to have a discussion and to find some, as you said, real human connections. It's the basis for everything good in life. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it very much. You can read more about these stories that we mentioned today by visiting our website. We'll also provide you with links there. We'd love to continue the conversation with you, so let us know what you think on our Facebook page. We'll be right back with former Seattle Mayor Norm Rice. Stay tuned. Thank you all very much.